Hello, everyone. My name is Caitlin Yeager, Director of Heritage Programs for Missouri Humanities. Thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual Cultural Heritage Workshop webinar on historic preservation strategies for rural communities. This program is presented by Missouri Humanities, and our mission is to enrich lives and strengthen communities by connecting Missourians with the people, places, and ideas that shape our society. Whether you're joining us on Zoom or watching on Facebook Live, we invite you to interact with us throughout this program. If you are on Facebook, feel free to comment to let us know you're watching and leave us questions for our Q&A session towards the end of our program. If you're on Zoom, you can use either the chat feature or the Q&A feature to ask questions throughout the discussion. And we'll address as many of those questions as we can during our Q&A session at the end of the program. If you enjoy our program today and are interested in seeing more from Missouri Humanities, please check us out on Facebook or on our website for the most up-to-date information about our events. We also have a membership program where benefits include free books, discounted tickets to special programs, and access to members-only events. To become a member, visit www.mohumanities.org and click Memberships under the Donate tab. After our program today, I'll be sending everyone an email with a link to our program survey. I would really appreciate it if you could all take some time to let us know what you thought of the presentation today. These surveys are really important to us as we continue to bring public programming to Missourians and work toward a more thoughtful, informed, and civil society. Now, with all that said and done, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today. Kelsey Matson is the Certified Local Government Coordinator for the State Historic Preservation Office, a division of Missouri State Parks under the Department of Natural Resources. Kelsey's presentation will discuss strategies for small or remote communities to establish and maintain a preservation program, as well as the tools and resources available to support local preservation activities. So without further ado, Kelsey, I'll have you take it away.
Thank you, Caitlin. So I want to begin by thanking Missouri Humanities and Caitlin Yeager for coordinating this workshop. And I also want to thank our previous presenters, Sean Rost and Bill Hart, for their wonderful presentations. So for those of you who may not be familiar with me or my work, I'm the Certified Local Government Coordinator for the State Historic Preservation Office. And we will talk more about what that means exactly later on in the talk. But the State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO, that's the acronym. So if you hear me say SHPO, that's what I mean, is the state agency that carries out the mandates of the National Historic Preservation Act. So we coordinate historic preservation activities that are legally mandated on a federal or state level. And my job in particular is to work with local communities on their local historic preservation programs. So there's a variety of reasons why you might be tuning in today. Maybe you want to learn more about how to take care of your historic home or your historic neighborhood or your historic town. Or maybe you're seeing changes taking place in your community like these that have you worried, like neglect or urban sprawl. So the purpose of this talk, as Caitlin mentioned, is to provide some tools and resources for local communities, particularly smaller or more rural communities, to either start building a local historic preservation program, or if a program already exists, to begin to consider thinking about growing it in new ways. So what is historic preservation? Well, very, very broadly speaking, historic preservation is the practice of thinking through how to manage historic resources. And it may include activities like the administration of historic house museums and historic sites, maintenance of private homes, adaptive reuse of historic buildings, preservation planning, land use planning, lobbying, or advocacy. And if you tuned into the last presentation by Bill Hart, he talked about the difference between those activities. Fundraising, or any number of other activities. And of course, not every preservation program is going to include all of these things, all these activities, but these, and in fact, not every preservation program is legally allowed to engage in all of these activities, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. But these are all elements that may be included in different kinds of preservation programs. So it may include resources in addition to buildings, which might be what we would typically think of. It might include resources like public art, cemeteries, whole neighborhoods or districts, farms, infrastructure like roads, bridges, utilities systems, that kind of thing, landscapes, and these might be cultural or natural, or some combination of the two. Prehistoric archaeological sites or historic archaeological sites, or any number of other objects. So this is the Historic Preservation Power Grid, and this chart is not my creation. I want to give credit where credit is due. I've borrowed this version from the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions, which you see on this chart up in the national nonprofit category. It's a nonprofit organization that assists local historic preservation commissions. But this chart is a graphic representation of how power and authority in preservation activities is distributed across sectors. The public sector, quasi-public, nonprofit, and private, and different levels. So the national level, state level, or local level. And at the local level, I do want to note, this chart uses Saline County as a representative example, but please feel free to mentally substitute in your local government, your local community. You know, whatever your town is or your county. So whatever your local historic preservation commission or your local historic society is, please feel free to substitute that in at the local level. So the powers and responsibilities of each of these entities, that is, each of these boxes, are defined by law. So national entities are defined by federal law. State entities are defined by federal and state law, and local entities are defined by federal, state, and local law. And so the Missouri SHPO is a public agency that operates at the state level. So that's where my jurisdiction is and where my office's jurisdiction is. And you see that here in the yellow box. We are a public state agency. And maybe you tuned in to the talk before mine by Bill Hart of Missouri Preservation, and you see MoPres over there in the state nonprofit box. And in his talk, he talked about some local advocacy organizations. So they would be down in the local nonprofit box. And so you, as listeners of this talk, may, I don't know for sure, but you may be located down here in the local category somewhere. And so, as I alluded, all of these entities have different powers and limitations depending on where we're positioned in this chart. And that's why it takes all of us working together in order to protect all historic places. So for me in my office, the State Historic Preservation Office, these are the services with which we can help you and we can advise or assist you. So we coordinate the National Register of Historic Places. We coordinate historic surveys and inventories of historic resources, and those may be architectural surveys or archaeological. We help to ensure compliance with the Section 106 process, which, if you're not familiar with Section 106, it requires federal agencies to take into consideration the effects of their actions on historic properties. We help to assist with rehabilitation tax incentives, and we also coordinate the Certified Local Government Program, which is my wheelhouse. That's what I do. And so, again, just to reiterate, there's a lot of different historic preservation activities that might not fall into one of these 5 categories, but this is where our jurisdiction and expertise lies, ours being the State Historic Preservation Office. So again, a moment ago, I provided this definition of historic preservation, but it's actually a little more complicated than that, especially if you are operating anywhere in the public category on that preservation power grid over on the left. Then you're going to need to use a special definition of historic property and historic preservation. Now there are some exceptions at the local level. There's a little bit more flexibility in the local public category. So if you do, if you are familiar with your community's local historic preservation program and you think, no, that's not exactly what we use, that's true. There is more flexibility at the local public level. But generally speaking, if you are operating in the public level, or in the public sector, rather, excuse me, this is the definition that you should be aware of. And if you are familiar with historic preservation already, you may recognize that these are the criteria that a property needs to meet in order to be eligible to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And to be historic, quote unquote historic, a property does not have to be listed. It just has to be eligible to be listed. And I know in the previous talk, in the Q&A session, a question came up about the process of getting a property listed on the National Register. And I'm not going to go through the entire process of getting a property listed, but I will just make a couple of points. That the National Register designation is purely honorary. Like Bill said in the Q&A session, you can get a property listed today and demolish it tomorrow. So there's no protection associated with it. It's simply a documentation of the property and a recognition that it is significant. And getting a property listed on the National Register, it can be a lengthy process, but it is fairly straightforward. And we at the SHPO do provide grants to CLGs to assist in that process. There's no fee associated with the actual listing or nomination process, but it can be helpful to hire a professional consultant to prepare the nomination form. So those grants can be used to offset that cost. So the criteria here to be historic or to be National Register eligible, however you want to think about it, is that number one, they have to be old enough. And typically that's 50 years. Again, like at the local level, that number can vary a bit. And there are considerations even at the national level. But typically the rule of thumb is about 50 years. It needs to retain integrity. That is, it needs to look basically the same as it did historically at its period of significance. And then it also needs to be significant under one of the following criteria. So it needs to be associated with significant historic events, activities, or developments. B, It can be associated with the lives of people who were important in the past. C, it can be significant in the areas of architectural history, landscape history, or engineering. Or D, it has the potential to yield information in the future. And this is the criterion that's typically used for archaeological resources, that they may reveal additional information in the future. So again, just as an aside, I want to say that this definition, the US government's definition of historic, is not, they don't have a monopoly. The US government does not have a monopoly on the term historic. And there are many places that are worthy of protection, but they may not quite meet these specific criteria. And it doesn't mean they're not worthy of protection. It just means that they don't meet this definition. So if you're operating in another category, like a nonprofit category or a private category even, you're not bound by this definition. And so again, I just want to reiterate that it takes all of us working together to protect important places. All right, so now that we know what historic preservation is, or we have some sense of that, why would we want to do it? Well, there's a lot of reasons why we would want to preserve historic places. And I'll go through a couple of them here. Preservation helps us to take pride in who we are as a community. So the Athenian Code stated that we will transmit this city not only, not less, but greater and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us. And so historic preservation today is a mechanism to help us do that. We in the present are stewards of the past. We're stewards of our forebears' work and efforts, and preservation helps us to protect those things. And it's also a vehicle to help serve our current needs as our respective communities. It can be a tool to help facilitate beautification and to create aesthetically pleasing places in which to live or work. It has educational, experiential, and academic value. Our physical and cultural landscapes are an archive. They teach us about the past, and they document the past, and they document our history and travel through time as a community. And on top of that, they're not just a subject of study unto themselves, but they're also a way to learn methods for critical thinking and to teach other kinds of abstract educational concepts. Economic benefits. So many studies document that investment in preservation programs yields positive economic benefits for residents, for property owners, for businesses, and for local governments. Environmental benefits. So because the energy and material input invested in the original construction, in the original building, is already there, reusing it means that we have reduced the extraction costs and the disposal costs to the environment that might be incurred by a new construction. So there are environmental and energy benefits as well. Representation. So depending on how it's used, historic preservation can be a tool to tell the stories and lift the voices of historically underrepresented communities. And the National Park Service offers grants to support the preservation of underrepresented communities and historically Black colleges and universities. And I'll talk more about grants in a minute, but I want to mention that this particular website, the African American Heritage Trail in Kansas City, was prepared with the support of a grant from the SHPO. Affordable housing. So this building that you're looking at here, in 2015, the National Trust for Historic Preservation and Department of Housing and Urban Development's Secretary's Award for Excellence in Historic Preservation was presented, to the 3010 Apartments Limited Partnership for rehabilitating this property that was a historic home for orphaned and abandoned boys, for rehabilitating it into affordable housing. And it also improves quality of life, just in a general sense. It provides a sense of place, it creates community character in a tangible way, and it creates nice places to live your life or to invest your business. Or last but not least, maybe you just own a property and you want to take care of it. You want to maintain your property. And historic preservation provides tools for how to do that well. So hopefully there's at least one thing on that list that you care about and that you are invested in supporting. So how do we do that? Well, one way is through the establishment of a local government preservation program. So what is a local preservation program? So again, returning to this chart, the primary purpose of this talk is to provide information about historic preservation resources for rural communities. And of course, not everything local is rural, and not everything rural is local. I don't mean to imply that, of course. But for the purpose of this webinar, I'll be talking mostly about historic preservation activities and programs that fall into this local category. And again, as a visual reference, the blue is where you may be located, and then the yellow and red box is where I am located on the preservation power grid. And the green, it's kind of green, kind of an aqua color, is where you and I are most likely to intersect in our activities. So again, my purpose with the SHPO is to provide assistance to entities in the local public category, that is that lower left category, especially certified local governments and local historic preservation commissions. Okay, so what does that mean? So the term certified local government, if I'm speaking candidly, I don't particularly like that term because it doesn't, there's no intuitive connection to historic preservation. But what it is a federal program that is part of the National Historic Preservation Act. And it was established actually through an amendment to the original National Historic Preservation Act. So it was established in 1980. And it expanded the existing partnership between the National Park Service and the state historic preservation offices. So of course, every state has a state historic preservation office, and we are partnered with the National Park Service in our duties. So the Certified Local Government Program expanded that partnership to also include local governments. And the definition of a local government in this context is a county or municipality. And so the CLG program provided a set of best practices for the establishment and maintenance of local preservation programs. And it also provided a funding stream, that is those grants that I talked about, for federal funding to go to local preservation programs. So what are the benefits of joining this program? Well, I mean, I kind of touched on some of them, but the community becomes a partner in the National and State Historic Preservation Program network. Being a CLG provides access to training and technical assistance from the State Historic Preservation Office and even the National Park Service to a certain extent. It provides a streamlined process for the participation of nominations of local properties to the National Register of Historic Places. And then the big one that a lot of people are interested in is grants. We give money to support preservation activities. And those activities might include any number of things: education, surveys, archaeological or architectural surveys, the preparation of National Register nominations, like I talked about before, planning, architectural assessments, or historic structure reports, or other outreach tools, and those might be websites or apps or any number of things. And this isn't a comprehensive list, but this just gives you a sense of the kinds of things that these grants may be used for. So in Missouri, there are 63 certified local governments on the books, including cities, villages, and 1 county. And many of them, as you can see from this map, are kind of clustered in the middle third of the state along the I-70 corridor. And many also are part of the Kansas City or St. Louis metro area. Many of them are suburbs to Kansas City or St. Louis. So again, there are many other communities throughout the state that I would love to see join the Certified Local Government Program. There's a lot of empty space on this map, but these are the CLGs that we have at this moment. So how does a community become a CLG? So CLG preservation programs must meet specific criteria established by the National Park Service and also by the State Historic Preservation Office of whatever state they happen to be in. So, and each state has different criteria. So a CLG in Missouri might meet slightly different criteria than a CLG in, Kansas or New York or Montana or any other state. And each CLG in Missouri meets 5 basic requirements to get certified and to stay in good standing with the program. So the first one, the local government shall enforce appropriate state or local legislation for the designation and protection of historic properties. What this means basically is that the community passes a historic preservation ordinance, that is a local law, that establishes the local historic preservation program. And this is copied from the sample template ordinance that I sometimes provide to communities who are interested in joining the CLG program. And if your community has a historic preservation ordinance on the books, it may not look exactly like this. In fact, it probably doesn't. Or if you're considering joining the program and passing a preservation ordinance, it doesn't have to look exactly like this. It's okay to cherry pick your purpose statements, to pick the ones that are most meaningful to your community or to create new ones. But this I just copied to represent, to show the state's sample preservation purpose statement. So the second requirement, the local government shall establish by state or local law and maintain an adequate and qualified historic preservation review commission. And they're not always called historic preservation commissions. They might be the Landmarks Board or the Downtown Review Board or the Advisory Board. The name doesn't matter so much. What matters is that they're established for the purpose of coordinating historic preservation activities within the CLG, and that they're adequate and qualified. Three, the local government shall maintain a system for survey and inventory of historic properties. So that's pretty straightforward. The CLG needs to have some kind of survey, either already established or you don't have to have a survey in order to get certified, but you have to have a plan to have one in the near future. 4, the local government shall provide for adequate public participation in the local historic preservation program. Again, this is pretty straightforward. Certified local government programs are government programs, they're public programs, so they must abide by all state and local sunshine laws. And of course, any interested parties have to be given the opportunity to participate in the process. 5, the local government shall satisfactorily perform the responsibilities delegated to it under the National Historic Preservation Act. So again, there are a few powers and duties that the federal government delegates specifically to the local government. For example, reviewing and approving new National Register nominations. So again, that's why it's so important for those of you in CLGs to provide your approval of new National Register nominations, because that is one of your delegated duties. But generally speaking, this requirement just means that the local government should not do anything that explicitly is contradictory to the National Historic Preservation Act. So to break it down into kind of 3 essential pieces, any preservation program, whether it's state or federal or local, is going to have these 3 basic pieces. Identification, excuse me, is that survey that we talked about, that survey and inventory, which at the local level is a helpful tool for local government. It helps with land use planning and economic development. It helps with identifying significant properties before they're threatened so that you can more effectively protect them. And it helps you to consider preferable locations for new development. Registration is designation, so it would be designating a property under your local historic preservation program by the criteria that you've determined in your local ordinance. And then preservation, and that typically at the local level, that includes design review and the issuance of certificates of appropriateness, although it can be any number of other things, but that's what we see most commonly. And these are other kinds of preservation activities that the CLG might engage in. So public education and outreach, actual like rehabilitation of properties, or salvage operations. Sometimes we see those. Planning or the development of design guidelines. These are all other kinds of preservation activities. So this flowchart is, it's simplified, of course, but really the process of getting certified as a CLG is pretty straightforward. You talk to me and I will, help guide you through the whole process. Your community drafts and passes a historic preservation ordinance that meets specific criteria. You appoint a qualified historic preservation commission. Then when all of that is done, then you send your request, that is the local government sends its request for certification to me, and I'll review it and sign off on it. And then I will forward that to the National Park Service. And the National Park Service is the agency that issues the final certification. So it really is a pretty straightforward process. It can take a while, but it's not too difficult from an administrative standpoint. There are other types of historic preservation programs, and I mean, other than certified local governments, and I'm realizing we're getting close to time, but there are other types of local preservation programs. So for example, there's a local historic, you might have a local historic district with administrative design review, where the design review goes through the Board of Aldermen or Planning and Zoning, but there's no Historic Preservation Commission involved. So that would not be the same as a CLG, as a certified local government program, but it is still a different type of preservation program. There might be conservation districts, and a certified local government might have historic districts and conservation districts. Those two are not mutually exclusive. And a conservation district might mean different things in different communities. That definition might vary, but basically it means that a district does not meet the criteria for the historic designation, but it is still architecturally or culturally significant and worthy of protection. And so it might be designated as a conservation district in that case. You might see local historic district in name only, where there's no design review involved. So this is Old Town, the Old Town district in Jefferson City, which is simply defined by the historic boundaries of the city as it was originally incorporated. And there's no design review or any other protections in place. That just happens to be the definition of that district. Or local government support of other preservation activities, like the rehabilitation or restoration of locally significant properties, like this one in Caledonia. So again, to return to the core kind of topic of this talk, the U.S. Census Bureau defines rural as those places that are not part of a town or city of 2,500 residents or more. So of course, I'm not only talking to folks in this narrow category, but it helps us to start thinking about what a rural preservation program might look like. So in Missouri, we have 11 rural CLGs, 10 municipalities, plus Saline County. And here's a few of them. Arrow Rock, which I think is population 55 now, according to Google. But it is a National Historic Landmark. It's also a state park, and it's also a certified local government community. Augusta, Missouri, is population 255, give or take, and is another small rural certified local government. Pasadena Hills, like Arrow Rock, Pasadena Hills is fully listed on the National Register. The entirety of the town is National Register listed. Weston, Missouri, is population 1,808, and they have a great local brick and mortar, like facade grant program. And Hermann, Missouri, which is population 2,336. And Hermann has a very robust design review and certificate of appropriateness program. So there's a lot of different ways that you might see, you know, that your local rural community might develop their preservation program. And these are just some model examples. So 4, how to preserve. So now we know what historic preservation is, why we might want to do it, and what a local government historic preservation program might look like, particularly in the context of the Certified Local Government Program. So again, just to reiterate, there's a lot of different ways that a local government program might look, and a lot of forms it might take. But my area of expertise is down here in the local public category. So that's kind of what these recommendations are derived from. But step 1, find out what already exists. So regardless of what your goals are or where you identify personally as being located on the preservation power grid, it's important to know whether your local community is a certified local government, or if there's some other preservation program in place at the legal level, at the local government level. So if you don't already know, and many of you probably do, but if you don't, make sure to find out, is there already a historic preservation program in place? Is your community already a CLG? So reach out to your local government and see what they tell you. Or you can reach out to me and I can help you to uncover that if you don't know. Step 2, consider what matters to you in your community. So what are the places that matter to you, that you see as being significant? And maybe they're buildings, but they don't have to be. They might be landscapes, they might be other objects. They could be intangible things like cultural traditions or legacy businesses. And you can incorporate all of those things in your historic preservation program, in your local program. And then think about why you want to preserve them, how to preserve them, what the goals of your program are. Step 3, elect preservationists and advocate for preservationists in appointed or hired positions of local government. And of course, I can't tell you who to vote for exactly, but just remember that these are the people who make the decisions in your community. So if you don't know who your city manager is, if you don't know who's on your city council, or who the head of planning and economic development is in your community, find out, look that up. Maybe give them a call even, or send them an email. It's their job to respond to you as a constituent of theirs. So make sure that you are aware of who you're electing, and and elect people who share your values. Get active. This is a general one, but join existing local preservation efforts, or if you can't find one that quite meets your goals, of course, you can consider starting a new one, either in the private, the nonprofit categories, or as a certified local government, or some other public entity. Engage. So again, this piggybacks on the previous points, but engage with everyone, your public officials, private property owners, the general public, nonprofit entities or other partners, the press, the media, and everyone else, the people who are not yet engaged. this again kind of is a corollary to the last one, but talk to the SHPO, engage with us as well. We're here to help you, so don't hesitate to, send me an email if there's something that you think that I might be able to assist you with, or that the SHPO might be able to assist you with. Send me an email and I'll either assist you or try to point you towards someone who might be able to help you more effectively. And step 6, start or expand a local preservation program, particularly a certified local government program. If your community is not yet a CLG, consider starting one. Talk to me and I will help you out. And these are bonus tips, just bonus talking points, but I unfortunately don't have time to cover all of those right now. But I want to thank you all so much for tuning in to my talk here. Don't hesitate to give me a call. My email is up there on the title screen, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have now.
Thanks, Kelsey. And yeah, everyone take note of Kelsey's email address right there, kelsey.matson@dnr.mode.gov. We had a couple people ask for an electronic copy of your PowerPoint. Is that something you'd be willing to give out if someone were to reach out?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so if anyone, I know there's a couple of you that asked for it. So if anybody would like to get an electronic copy, whether it's a PDF or scan of Kelsey's PowerPoint, because I know she had a lot of really great tips on there, send her an email. Email is up on the screen right now, and I'm sure she'd be happy to send that along to you guys. So a question we have, what are the biggest obstacles you've seen for communities who want to create a CLG?
I think that creating a CLG it's not something you can do on your own. It really does take a village, both literally and metaphorically. So you need to do a lot of coalition building, from the outset. You need to make sure that your local government is on board, that your mayor is on board, your board of aldermen, your building inspector. So you have to make sure that all of those people in the local government understand the purpose and that they are supportive, to the extent that you can bring them around. And then of course, the community. So there's a lot of education and outreach involved as well, to make sure that the members of your local community understand the value of the program. And so if those things are not done effectively, it can be hard to get traction. It can be hard to get traction for the CLG program. So make sure that you are definitely doing that coalition building. Practice your elevator speech for the significance of your CLG program. You never know who you might be bumping into, especially in a smaller or more rural community. You can bump into the mayor at the grocery store, right? And so if you have the opportunity to, pitch your goals for historic preservation, do it. Another challenge that you sometimes see, particularly in these smaller communities, is expertise. So the Certified Local Government Program is meant to be accessible to everyone. It shouldn't be prohibitive to join it or to be a successful CLG based on your community's ability to recruit people with particular professional qualifications. So but it is important to make sure that whoever you recruit to your Historic Preservation Commission, that they do have an interest in historic preservation, that they have some kind of knowledge of it. Maybe they're a carpenter, maybe they're a teacher. They don't have to be a professional architect or a professional archaeologist, although that would be great if you can recruit people with those professional credentials. Of course, that's recommended and encouraged. But if your community is very small, and you just can't find people with those professional qualifications, that's okay too. But just make sure that whoever you are recruiting, ideally has some kind of connections. Maybe they're a teacher, maybe they're a journalist or a lawyer. Also, make sure that they are getting adequate education and training after they've been appointed. So that is a requirement of the Certified Local Government Program, is that every Historic Preservation Commission member, and local government support staff person needs to get some training every year, pursuant to their duties. So make sure that you're focusing on education and training after they've been appointed. So anyway, my point is that finding and recruiting qualified preservation commissioners can be a tricky one sometimes. And then, of course, just making sure that you have enough community support and enough local government support. It really does take a village. So make sure that you're brushing up on your, on your elevator speech, on your PR, PR strategies.
So while I'll let people take some time in case we have any more questions, I don't have any current questions, so I'll give you guys a couple more minutes to submit. But in the meantime, so something that Bill talked about, with, like getting a property listed on the National Register, and how that opens up funding opportunities. It doesn't do anything really all that official. It designates it, but really it's an opportunity. It's a recognition, and it really opens up a lot of money opportunities to help, with grants or with preservation activities, et cetera. Is a CLG kind of similar like that, to where it really opens you up to a lot of other potential funding opportunities or projects that you might not otherwise be eligible for?
Yeah, absolutely. So backtracking to the point about listing a property on the National Register, it is, again, it's an honorary designation, and there's no protection associated with it. So it doesn't restrict you in any ways. You can still do whatever you want with your property. But it does open you up to things like rehabilitation, tax incentives, and certain grants from the National Park Service in certain cases, or other grants. And being a CLG is similar to that. I would say that there are more stringent requirements because it's a program with processes rather than just a singular designation like with the National Register. It's, it's a little bit more, there's more moving pieces with a CLG, so to speak. So there's more monitoring requirements for a CLG. You have to continuously meet those criteria. But yeah, then it opens you up to those historic preservation fund grants from the SHPO that I discussed. And those can be used for any number of things. One thing that they can't be used for is any kind of brick and mortar work. And a lot of times people are disappointed to hear that. A lot of times people are looking for money to help support their brick and mortar, to help rehabilitate their, their historic building. And unfortunately, these grants they can't be used for that at this time. But they can be used for a whole lot of other very important things. They can develop, websites, apps for the city, any kind of, brochures or publications or outreach. They can support training, workshops. Sometimes I'll see like a historic window treatment workshop. And that actually is a sneaky way of doing a little bit of brick and mortar restoration, because it's, contained within this educational program, and it can be used for education. So you can do something like a historic, window or historic treatment workshop, or planning documents, or architectural assessments, all of those kinds of things. And so, yeah, being a CLG, it's a very flexible program. There are certain requirements, but really it's a very flexible program. It's very adaptable. It can do really whatever you want it to, well, within reason. But it's my goal, of course, to make it as flexible and accessible as I can. I want to make it as accessible to as many communities as possible, and then once they have a local program that works for them and for the needs of their community, then it does open them up to those grants and, the technical assistance and all those other things that that I discussed earlier. And of course, other grants from the National Park Service too. Some of them are, there are some grants other than those Historic Preservation Fund grants. Occasionally, there are other grants that the NPS may offer.
And of course, when I say we had no more questions, we now have 4 questions. They literally came in all at once. But luckily, 2 of them are the same question, and that is, how do you handle, what do you do when you have, people who don't want a Historic Preservation Commission dictating what they can and can't do on their property?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, again, it goes back to in the formative state, when you're putting your CLG together and your HPC together in the first place, make sure that that you're doing enough public outreach and public education. But I mean, there are a couple of other strategies that you might consider to help kind of placate that. First of all, this is not ideal or recommended, but the Historic Preservation Board may be purely advisory, right? Like they might advise about architectural design, but have no power of enforcement or authority. And that's the case in some CLGs, and that's perfectly acceptable for the CLG program, and it still opens the community up to those grants and things, but it doesn't put the burden of actually enforcing anything on the community. Other strategies are owner consent, which is another one where ideally we would like to see CLGs where you don't have to get the consent of the property owner in order to get a property listed locally. But most of them, I would say, do have some kind of owner consent requirement where the owner has to agree to getting a property listed on the local register. And or if it's a district, then X percent of the residents of the district, maybe 50% or whatever the number may be, have to agree to the listing of the district. And then other strategies, it's helpful if you can provide local, incentives, like monetary incentives for property owners with historically designated properties. You know, if you make them available for, or if you make like local facade grants available to owners of historic properties, if you maybe make free or reduced parking for owners of historic properties, or tax, you know, tax incentives for those owners at the local level. You know, any kind of incentives, any carrots that you can put on a string, you know, is certainly gonna help you. But I'd say really just the more that you can, you know, rub elbows with everyone in your community, and the, you know, the better press you can get, you know, the better, certainly. Did that answer the question? I kind of forgot what the question was.
So I've got a few questions left, but for the sake of time, I'm going to randomly pick one of them because they're all good questions, and I'm going to pick this one. How are you requiring the education requirement of Historic Preservation Commission members right now during COVID?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And since you're watching this right now, this would count. This webinar, any of the 3 workshops or the 3 webinars for the workshop today, any or all of them would help count towards the training requirement. Like I said a moment ago, you know, every Historic Preservation Commission member and staff, local government staff member, has to get annual training. But I'm very flexible about what counts toward that training requirement. So there's tons and tons of awesome webinars out right now because of COVID, because there's not as much in-person training. You know, there's wonderful resources online, just like this one, or any number of, you know, of other webinars. I often point people towards the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They have some really wonderful webinars. The National Park Service has some good ones. You know, many of the things from Missouri Main Street Connection or Missouri Humanities might be eligible to meet that training requirement. It should have some kind of explicit historic preservation or cultural resource management bent to it. But any of these things would be perfectly good options to meet that training requirement. Just make sure that whoever prepares your certified local government annual report, just make sure that you know, that they make note of it, of the participation on the annual report form, so that I know that you watched the webinar, that you participated in it, and that you got, you know, so that I can give you credit for those training hours. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, I'm sorry everyone, we're out of time. I know we had a couple of lingering questions there. If your question didn't get answered, of course, feel free to reach out to Kelsey if you're really wanting that question answered. I'm sure she'd be happy to answer it via email.
Absolutely, for sure.
A little bit, so I want to make sure that I respect everyone's time. Thank you to everybody that helped out today. Kelsey, thank you for your presentation, as well as Bill Hart from Missouri Alliance for Historic Preservation, and Sean Ross from the State Historical Society of Missouri. They were our 2 previous webinars for today. And all of this was, of course, part of our virtual cultural heritage workshop series. I'm so grateful that I was able to do another one of these for everybody. Stay tuned to Missouri Humanities for more upcoming programs. If you want to see more from us, visit www.mohumanities.org/events. We've got a ton of stuff coming up for the fall. COVID has not slowed us down. It's just made us pivot to virtual, and we are full force going forward with virtual programming. So we're very, very busy, and we would love you guys to check us out. We do lots of different events other than heritage programs. So lots of things for everybody to get involved with. I will be sending out, like I said, that survey email. So keep a lookout for that. And I will let you all go. I will not take up any more of your time. Kelsey, again, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. Thanks everyone.